The wind on the morning Roy Marsh was buried did not move like ordinary wind. It moved like a hand, a flat, deliberate hand pressing down on the brown October grass, pressing down on the four men who carried the pine box, pressing down on the woman who walked behind them with her boots too large and her coat belonging to a man who no longer needed it. Nell Marsh was 64 years old. She had lived on this quarter section of Dakota soil for 38 years. She had survived two droughts, one flood of winter that killed every chicken she owned, and a grief so old it had become simply the texture of ordinary days. But she had never walked behind Roy before. She had always walked beside him. And the distance between beside and behind on that particular morning, in October of 1886, was the distance between one life and another. She counted her steps. She counted because her hands could not do anything useful. Her hands were busy holding each other inside the deep pockets of Roy's wool coat, which still smelled like sawdust, and the green soap he had used every morning of their marriage, and like the particular warmth of a man who had always run slightly warmer than the air around him. She held her own hands inside that coat, and she counted. 43 steps from the gate to the grave. She would remember that number for the rest of her life. The minister said those words he always said. The four men lowered the box into the ground. The earth made the sound it makes when it accepts something it did not ask for. A wet and reluctant sound, a sound like a door being closed from the other side. And then it was over. The neighbors walked back toward their horse and their wagons with the particular efficiency of people who have done this before and will do it again and understand that the kindest thing they can offer now is speed. Nell stood at the grave until she could no longer hear the wheels on the frozen road. Then she turned and walked the 43 steps back. Roy had been fine on a Tuesday. He had been swinging an axe at the woodpile when she brought him his midday coffee, and he had taken the cup with both hands the way he always did, wrapping his fingers all the way around it. And he had said the wood was good this year, dry all the way through, and they would not want for heat. He had said it with the particular satisfaction of a man who prepares for things before they arrive. He had always been that kind of man. 3 days later, he was in the pine box. 3 days from a man talking about dry wood to a man in the ground, and the fever that took him had moved with a speed that left no room for goodbyes, that were actually goodbyes only for the ordinary small words that people say to each other on ordinary days, not knowing those days are about to stop. She had been a court clerk for 12 years before she came west with Roy. She had kept records of other people's losses for 12 years. She had thought that work had taught her something about grief. It had not taught her anything about this. The first 3 days she moved through the cabin the way a person moves through deep water. Everything required more force than it should. The coffee pot weighed more than she remembered. The door to the barn weighed more. Her own body weighed more, as though grief had a physical mass that settled into the bones and stayed. She did not eat properly. Cold oats by the spoonful standing at the stove. A swallow of water. The two hens in the barn ate better than she did. Roy had named them Bess and Dot. Nell could not tell them apart. She had never been able to tell them apart, and Roy had always found this funny, and now there was no one to find it funny, and she fed them in the gray morning light without speaking to them and went back inside. On the fourth day, she made herself open the cupboard. She made herself look. A sack of oats, a crock of salt pork, 7 jars of tomatoes she had put up in August, dried beans, a small tin of coffee, 2 onions, some flour, and tucked behind the flour tin, pushed to the back as though someone had been hiding them from themselves, a stack of papers held together with a piece of twine. She pulled them out with flat hands and set them on the table and sat down. She read for a long time. Roy had taken an extension on the land note in March. She had known about the extension. What she had not known was the additional draw for spring seed, or the secondary lien attached to the barn improvements, or the notation in the margin of one page that referred to a document she had never seen. She spread the papers across the table and weighted the corners with the salt crock and the coffee tin, and she read everything twice. She had been a court clerk for 12 years. She had organized and filed and cross-referenced the legal documents of Calhoun County, Minnesota for 12 years before Roy had come through that office with a question about property filing and stayed to ask her a different question entirely. She knew how to read these papers. She knew what the numbers should look like when they were honest. These numbers did not look honest. She sat with her hands flat on the table for a long time after she finished reading. The stove had gone cold. She did not notice. Outside, the wind moved the dry grass in long, slow waves, and the sky was the pale, indifferent blue of a day that does not know it is unwelcome. On the fifth day, she did not get up for 6 hours. This is not grief, she told herself. Grief has a shape. Grief has a beginning and a kind of path through even when you cannot see where the path goes. What she was sitting inside right now did not have a shape. It was weather. It was the inside of a cloud. It was the particular quality of being 64 years old on a piece of land that had been her life for 38 years and was now possibly being taken from her, while her husband was still fresh in the ground, and she did not yet know how to be a person who did not have Roy. On the sixth morning, she heard a horse. She heard it before she saw it. She knew the sound of a town horse. A town horse moves differently than a farm horse. A town horse has a kind of rhythm to it, a deliberate placement of hooves, the gait of an animal that expects to be watched. She wiped her hands on her apron. She did not know why. Her hands were already clean. It was the gesture her mother had used whenever anyone came to the door. The automatic preparation of a woman who had been raised to receive the world with her hands clean and her spine straight, regardless of what the world was bringing. She opened the door. The man on the horse was not a man she had met before, but she knew the type immediately. She had known the type her whole life in courthouses and in creditors' offices, and in the particular way certain men sit on a horse. When they have come to do business, they expect to go their way. He was perhaps 45, heavy in the shoulders, wearing a coat that had cost real money and a hat that had cost more. He carried a leather satchel under one arm. His face had been arranged into an expression of sympathetic practicality, each feature placed with the care of a man who has used this face before and found it effective. Behind him on a second horse rode a younger man, perhaps 28, lean and watchful, saying nothing. The man in the expensive coat did not dismount. That was the first thing Nell noticed. He had ridden onto her property and stopped at her fence line, and he sat on his horse and looked at her, standing in the doorway, and he did not swing down. He did not remove his hat. He held the satchel against his ribs, and he spoke from the height of the saddle, as though the height were a reasonable place from which to have a conversation with a widow of 6 weeks standing on her own porch. His name was Victor Caldwell. He represented the Northern Pacific Land Office. He had come, he said, because he wanted to spare her any unnecessary difficulty. His voice was warm. His voice was the warmest thing about him. She had the distinct impression, standing on that porch in Roy's oversized coat, that this man had given this speech many times before, that there was a version of this speech for different kinds of widows, that hers was the version for women who were old enough to be practical, but possibly not old enough to understand the full weight of what they were facing. He talked for 11 minutes. She counted. He talked about Roy. He talked about the extension Roy had taken in March and the additional draw in May and the secondary lien she had only discovered the day before. He called Roy's death the unfortunate circumstance. He talked about the impossibility, regrettable but real, of a woman of her years managing a property of this size through a Dakota winter. He used the phrase alone and unassisted twice. He talked about a number which was the total of what she owed. The number was larger than it should have been. And then he talked about a second number, which was what the railroad was prepared to offer her. It was, he said, generous. It was, he said, more than fair given the circumstances. It was, he said, enough for a train ticket east and a fresh start. He produced a document from the leather satchel and held it out toward her. He did not lean down to hand it to her. He held it out and waited for her to come to the horse to take it. So, Nell looked at the document. She looked at his hand holding it. She looked at the distance between the porch where she was standing and the fence where his horse stood. She did not move. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He paused. "My name is on that deed." He said yes. Her name was on the deed alongside her husband's. "Mine," she said. "Not just his. Mine." "Yes," he said. "That was the legal situation." "Then I will need time to read it," she said. "More time than 11 minutes. His face did something small behind the eyes. She had worked in a courthouse long enough to recognize the look of a man recalibrating. He had registered that she was counting. He had come prepared for tears, for confusion, for the quiet and desperate cooperativeness of a woman who did not fully understand her own situation. He had not come prepared for a woman who counted. He would return on the 1st of December, he told her. That would give her ample time to consider her options. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that had been purchased along with the coat. Be practical, Mrs. Marsh. Winter does not care how brave you are. He turned the horse. The younger man turned with him. They rode east down the frozen road without looking back. Nell stood on the porch and watched them until they disappeared. She watched the empty road for another long moment after that. Then she went inside and sat at the table and did not move for a considerable time. Be practical, Mrs. Marsh. She said it out loud alone in the cold cabin. She said it with his warmth and his smile underneath it, the precise intonation of a man who has decided that he is being kind. She said it again. And the third time she said it, she heard what lived underneath the words. What lived underneath was a not concern for her welfare. What lived underneath was a script written long before she was born, and long before Roy was born, and long before this land had her name on its deed. The script said that when a woman's husband died, the land reverted to the men who had been waiting for it. The script said that her presence on this ground was conditional on Roy's presence, and Roy was in the ground now, and so the script said it was time for her to go. She stood up. Her knees ached. She had been sitting too long on a cold chair in a cold cabin, and her knees said so plainly. She walked to the cupboard. She took out the papers and set them on the table. She took out her mother's unopened letter, the one that had arrived from Minnesota 3 weeks ago, and that she had not been able to open because she already knew what it said. Come home now. There is nothing left for you there. You are not young anymore, and you are alone. Come home. She put the letter on the table with the papers because the letter and the papers belonged together in some way she could not yet name. They both assumed the same thing. They both assumed the ending was already written, and her only remaining task was to arrive at it. She looked at the pile on the table for a long time. Then she covered it with a dish towel so she would not have to look at it anymore. That night, she dreamed of Roy. Not a memory dream, not the kind where the dead come back with something wise and consoling to say. Just Roy sitting at the kitchen table repairing a harness or working the leather between his fingers with the focused patience he had given to all physical work, not looking up, not saying anything, simply there. The smell of the green soap and the wood shavings and the particular warmth he had always generated, that slightly too warm quality she had pressed herself against on cold nights for 38 years. She woke before dawn. The cabin was cold and dark, and she could see her own breath. She lay still for a moment watching it rise. If I leave, she thought. If I leave, who will remember he sat at that table? If I leave, this place becomes a line in a ledger in Victor Caldwell's satchel, a resolved matter, a number that came out in his favor. She got out of bed. She wrapped herself in the quilt off the bed, and she went to the cedar trunk at the foot of it. Roy's grandmother had brought this trunk from Pennsylvania. It had made 3 moves before it came to rest in this cabin, and it smelled like cedar and old wood and the faintest trace of dried lavender from something that had been stored in it long ago. She opened it. She was looking for Roy's second wool shirt. She had been sleeping in his first one for weeks, and she wanted to alternate them. She wanted to make them last. The second shirt was near the top. She lifted it out and held it against her face and breathed in the sawdust and the soap and the warmth that was already fading from the fabric, and she set it on the bed. She was about to close the trunk. She did not close the trunk, because at the bottom, flat against the cedar lining, was a book. Small and leather-covered, worn soft at the corners, the color of a chestnut. She had not seen this book in years. She had not thought about this book in years. But her hands recognized it before her mind did. The hands know what the mind sometimes forgets to remember. Her mother's journal, Mabel Fontaine, dead 11 years now. Dead in the spring of 1875, in a farmhouse outside St. Cloud, Minnesota, with her hands folded and her garden already planted for a summer she would not see. Nell lifted the journal with both hands. The leather was soft in the particular way old leather gets when it has been handled many times by someone who valued it. She sat on the edge of the bed and held it in her lap, and she did not open it for a while, because opening it felt like a door, and she was not sure yet which side of the door she was standing on, and she had the unreasonable but persistent feeling that whatever was inside this journal was going to ask something of her. She opened it. The first pages were what she expected. Her mother's handwriting, careful and slanted, the handwriting of a woman who had learned to write in a schoolhouse that did not usually educate girls and had taken the opportunity seriously. Recipes, preserved plum, rye bread, herb vinegar. She turned the pages slowly. The smell that rose from them was dried lavender and something else, something dry and faintly medicinal. The smell of her mother's kitchen in Minnesota, with the blue cups on the shelf and the window above the sink and the way the afternoon light had fallen across the pine table in a way that made it look like the table itself was glowing. She kept turning. Notes on a kitchen garden, a diagram of root vegetables, a list of medicinal teas. And then somewhere in the middle of the journal, the handwriting changed. Not the hand itself, the same careful slant. But the pressure was different. The pen had moved faster here, or the writer had been thinking harder, pressing down in a way that left slight ridges in the page. The heading was written in her mother's deliberate block letters, Earth Heat House. Nell stared at those three words for a long time. Below them were drawings, cross-sectional drawings, drawings of a structure dug into the ground. Not a simple root cellar, something more deliberate than that, something with a system to it. She read for 2 hours by the light of the oil lamp. Her mother had not invented what was in these pages. Her mother had recorded it. The journal said plainly that this was an old building tradition brought west by Scandinavian farming families who had built such structures in the home country and rebuilt them in Minnesota during the hard winters of the 1860s. The principle was something Nell had never considered before, though once she read it, it felt like something she had always half known without knowing she knew it. Below a certain depth, the earth does not freeze. Below a certain depth, the earth holds the temperature of the previous summer all winter long. Below a certain depth, the earth is a kind of reservoir, a slow battery, a record of warmth from the season before. You do not heat a room dug into the earth. You inherit the warmth that is already there, and a floor of dense stone charged occasionally with intense heat from above holds that heat for days and releases it slowly the way a hearthstone stays warm long after the fire has gone cold. You do not fight the cold. You decline to participate in it. The earth has already made the best terms available. You only have to accept them. Her mother had written at the bottom of the final diagram page, in the plain voice she used for things she considered settled. The men who build high walls and burn great fires are fighting the wrong battle. The cold is not a thing to defeat. It is a condition to negotiate with. The earth has already made its best offer. We only have to accept. Nell closed the journal. She held it with both hands and sat very still. She thought, this is impossible. And then almost immediately she thought, no, it is not. And then a third thought, slower and more particular, rose up like a dog hearing a sound outside. Roy never finished the floor in the barn. He had intended to lay planks. He had talked about it in August, sitting on the porch step with his coffee pointing across the yard. The man before us had some kind of storage pit in there, he had said. Whitmore, I think, left in '79. The thing's still down there somewhere. I should clear it out one of these days and put the floor in properly. He had not cleared it out. There had been no day for it, but it was there. She set the journal on the bed and lay down with her back to it as though it were watching her too closely. She told herself she was being foolish. She told herself she did not know how to build anything. She told herself she was 64 years old with bad knees and hands that ached in cold weather, and no one to help her in 35 days until the 1st of December. And then another thought arriving quietly in the dark. Roy had told her once on the night they had lit their first fire in this cabin, sitting on the floor together because there was no furniture yet, and the fire was new and everything was new. He had said it the way he said anything he meant deeply, quietly looking at his hands rather than at her, as though the words might scatter if he looked up. You are stronger than you know, Nell. I am only the lucky one who gets to watch. She rolled over. She picked up the journal. She pressed it against her chest with both hands. She slept. She was dressed and moving before the thought fully arrived in her waking mind. The why of what she was doing assembled itself while her hands were already reaching for the coat and the lamp and the boots she had left by the door. Some part of her had decided in the night and had simply been waiting for the rest of her to catch up. The air outside was still in the way that means cold is settled in properly, not visiting but taking up residence. Her breath came out in pale columns. She crossed the yard in the gray pre-dawn light, the lamp throwing its small circle of orange ahead of her feet, and she pushed open the barn door. She had not been inside the barn since the week Roy died. She stood in the doorway for a moment. She could see his hands on every board, the careful joinery at the corners, the way he had reinforced the cross beams, doing it twice because he had not trusted the first attempt and had not been a man who left things to chance. She let herself see his hands on every board for 60 seconds. She counted. Then she raised the lamp and looked at the floor. The packed earth was not even. She had not noticed before. There would have been no reason to notice. But with the lamp held low, moving it slowly across the surface, she could see what she was looking for. Near the center of the barn in a rough rectangle, perhaps 4 feet by 6, the soil was a different color, slightly darker, slightly more compacted in a way that was different from the natural compaction of the surrounding earth. The way a healed scar is a different color from the skin around it. She crouched down. Her knees spoke their usual opinion about this. She pressed her palm flat to the soil in the center of that rectangle, and then moved it 6 inches, and then pressed again. The center area gave just slightly under her hand, not much, barely enough to register. But it had been disturbed before. It had been dug out and then filled back in, and the filling had not fully compressed to match what surrounded it. Whitmore, I think. She straightened up and went to find the shovel. It was leaning against the back wall where Roy had always kept it, and when she took the handle in her hands, it was still Roy's handle, worn smooth from Roy's grip in the places Roy's grip had been. She carried it to the center of the barn, and she positioned the blade over the slightly darker rectangle of earth. She drove it in. The sound it made going into that disturbed soil was the most satisfying sound she had heard in 6 weeks. A clean, decisive bite, the earth accepting the blade without the resistance of untouched ground. She dug for an hour before her arms stopped cooperating. She sat down on the barn floor with her back against the post and breathed with her eyes closed, and felt the burn in her shoulders in the particular bar of pain across her upper back that she recognized as the complaint of muscles that had not been asked to work this way in some time. She sat for 10 minutes. Then she got up and dug for another half hour. The shovel hit something. The sound was wrong for dirt and wrong for stone, flat and slightly hollow, a dull wooden resonance. She got down on her knees on the cold dirt floor and brushed the soil away with her hands, sweeping it clear, with the edge of her palm working in slow, deliberate strokes. A plank appeared, then the edge of another plank parallel to the first. The two of them connected along one edge by iron hinges gone dark with oxidation. A door. A heavy cellar door lying flat in the packed earth, right where Roy had said there might be something, right where Ezra Whitmore had left it when he went east in '79, leaving behind this barn and this door and whatever was beneath it. She felt along the near edge of the door with her fingers until she found the iron ring. It had rusted to almost the same color as the soil around it. She wrapped her fingers around it and pulled. The door did not move. She had not expected it to move. A decade of packed earth and frost heave did not yield to the pull of a 64-year-old woman's arms. She needed a lever. She looked around the barn. Against the far wall, left over from when Roy had been planning the interior finishing, was a long piece of framing lumber, 8 feet at least. She dragged it over. She wedged one end under the iron ring, positioning it, carefully adjusting until the angle seemed right. Then she looked for a fulcrum. The bottom rail of the barn's interior framing post was the right height and the right hardness. She positioned the lumber across the rail. She stood on the free end. Nothing. She put more weight on it. She stopped standing and started leaning, pressing down with everything she had, using her arms on the rail beside her to add force. The lumber flexed. The ground around the door cracked. A thin seam opened around the edges of the frame, and something rose from it that she felt before she smelled it. A breath of air from underground, stale and close, and carrying something underneath the staleness that she could not immediately name. She pressed harder. The sound that came was long and low and tearing, like a seam of old cloth being pulled apart. The door lifted, 6 inches, then a foot. Then it was rising, and she was no longer pressing down, but holding back, controlling the ascent, and she got her shoulder under it and held it at 1.5 feet while she found her footing and repositioned. She was holding the door open with her shoulder and both arms, and the strain was considerable. And she was beginning to wonder what happened next when something moved in the dark below. Something small, something fast. It came up out of the dark opening, past her face in a burst of feathers and displaced air, a brown streak at the level of her cheek, and she stumbled back. The lamp rocked wildly on its nail. The cellar door came down and she barely caught it, lowering it to the floor with shaking arms, and she stood in the middle of her barn breathing hard and staring at the space above her head where the thing had gone. A sparrow. A small brown sparrow turning in a panicked arc near the roofline, finding the gap where the barn door stood ajar, and then it was gone. Out into the gray October morning and gone. Nell stood in the barn with her hand pressed flat against her breastbone. A sparrow. It had been living down there, in the sealed dark of that old cellar, in a space shut up for 10 years, through the worst Dakota winters on record. A small, warm-blooded creature had been alive. Something had kept it alive. She thought about that for a long moment. The sparrow should not be alive. The sparrow was alive. The sparrow had been alive in a sealed underground space through temperatures that killed cattle and broke iron. The earth below had not frozen. She stood there in the coal barn with the smell of the underground air still faint around her, and she did not say anything because there was no one to say anything to. But somewhere behind the place in her chest where she had been holding everything closed for 6 weeks, something shifted. Something moved, not dramatically, not like a wall falling, more like the sound a key makes when it finally finds the right alignment and the tumbler turns. She did not go down into the cellar that morning. She was not ready for that yet. She needed something first. She needed someone who knew things she did not know. She needed to know whether what she was thinking was possible or whether it was only the thinking of a woman who was frightened and alone and reaching for something that was not there. She closed the barn. She walked back to the cabin. She put coffee on and sat at the table and looked at her own hands while the water heated at the raw places along the base of each finger where the shovel handle had been, at the dirt still worked into the creases of her knuckles. She thought about who in this county might know what she needed to know. She thought about the woman she had seen in the autumn twice, once at the general store and once at the harvest gathering in September. A small, square woman with a leather-brown face and hands like she had been building things with them her entire life. A woman who had looked at Nell's supply list at Hendrick's store and said without softening that Nell was going to need 3 times that amount of salt pork if she intended to make it to March. A woman who at the harvest gathering had turned her back on Victor Caldwell when he walked through the door. Turned her back with such deliberate precision that the gesture had traveled across the entire room and registered on every person present. Agnes Polk, widow, 72 years old, quarter section north of the creek, had been working it alone since 1878, had built her own fence lines, had, according to what Nell had heard at the edges of conversations, she had not been meant to hear, some significant history with Victor Caldwell that made her the last person in this territory Caldwell ever wanted to see. Nell drank her coffee standing at the stove. She thought about what she would say. She thought about all the reasons Agnes Polk had no obligation to help her. She thought about walking up to the door of a woman she barely knew and asking her for something very large. Then she thought about the sparrow. Then she picked up her mother's journal from where she had left it on the table, and she put on Roy's coat, and she walked out the door and turned north. The wind had picked up from the north while she was inside. It carried something in it that was not quite cold, but was preparing to be. A sharpness at the edges, a metallic quality, the way winter announces itself before it fully commits. She felt it in the roots of her back teeth. She kept walking. Agnes Polk's property was 2 miles north of the creek. Nell had been there exactly once the previous spring when Roy had borrowed a post hole digger, and she had ridden along because it was the kind of afternoon that made you want to be moving. She remembered the property clearly. A small, tight house, well-maintained, nothing extra and nothing missing. A barn in better shape than most. Fence lines straight and solid. The property of a woman who looked at everything that needed doing and did it. The creek was frozen at the edges, but still running dark in the center. She stepped across it on the flat stones Roy had lined up there years ago for exactly this purpose. Stepping carefully, the journal pressed against her chest inside the coat to keep it dry. Her boots finding the stones by feel. The road north from the creek was hard under her boots. The sky had gone pale at the edges, a thin winter blue that held no warmth but was at least honest about it. She walked, and she did not allow herself to think about all the reasons this was unlikely to work. There would be time for that later. Right now, there was only the walking. She saw the house from a quarter-mile out, smoke from the chimney thin and straight in the still air. A horse in the small corral, heavy-bodied and calm, turning to watch her as she came up the road. The house itself was low and well-chinked, every gap between the logs filled and filled again by someone who understood that this territory had no patience for carelessness. Nell stopped at the gate. She straightened her spine. She smoothed Roy's coat with one hand. She lifted the latch. She walked to the door and knocked. She heard movement inside, then silence. Then the door opened, and Agnes Polk stood in the frame with the warm kitchen light behind her and looked at Nell standing on her step with frost on her eyelashes and her dead husband's coat in a leather journal clutched against her chest like a thing she was trying to protect or trying to gather courage from, which was both true. Agnes Polk was a small woman. Nell had forgotten how small, but small in the way certain things are small that are also very dense. Her face was the face of someone who had been outside in all weather for 50 years and had made a kind of peace with what the weather had to say. Her eyes were dark and direct, and they moved over Nell with the efficiency of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly. "You are the Marsh widow," Agnes said. "Yes, your husband died in September." "Yes." Agnes looked past her at the empty road, at the flat sky, at the particular quality of the late October morning that was not quite promising anything in any direction. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come inside," she said. "I will make coffee." Nell crossed the threshold. "Thank you," she said. Agnes said, "Do not thank me yet. I have not agreed to anything." The kitchen was small and warm and smelled like cedar and bacon grease and something dry and herbal that Nell could not name. There was a black stove, a scrubbed wooden table, a single rocking chair near the window with a folded shawl over the back. The kitchen of a woman who had made her solitude into a kind of order. No wasted space, nothing superfluous. Every object in the room had a reason for being exactly where it was. Agnes poured coffee from a blue enamel pot without asking how Nell took it and set the cup on the table and sat down across from her and put both hands flat on the wood and waited. Nell had rehearsed this on the walk over. She had rehearsed it with the same focused attention she had once used to prepare arguments for county records, disputes, organizing the sequence, anticipating the questions, knowing which details mattered and which were distraction. She opened the journal. She turned it so Agnes could see the cross-section drawings. She began to speak. She spoke carefully and in order the way she had been taught to speak in a courthouse when accuracy mattered. She described the barn. She described the cellar door. She described the sparrow. And when she said the word sparrow, something in Agnes's face shifted, not much, but enough for Nell to see it. She described the journal. She described the principle, the earth below the frost line, the thermal mass, the stone floor, the slow release of stored heat, the angle of the southern window. She spoke without stopping. Agnes did not interrupt. Agnes listened the way certain people pray, inward and complete, her eyes on the table and her hands still, and her entire attention given to what was being said with the generosity of a person who has learned that listening is not passive, that it is its own kind of work, and that it is owed to anyone who comes to your table with something real. When Nell stopped speaking, the kitchen was quiet except for the clock on the wall and the small sounds of the stove settling. Agnes picked up the journal. She held it at arm's length because her eyes had needed distance for some years. She studied the floor diagram for what seemed like a full minute. She turned a page and studied the ventilation drawing. She turned another page and studied the window angle. Then she set it down. "Your mother drew these," she said. "Yes, she ever built one. She helped her family build something like it in Minnesota in the 1860s. Her mother's family brought the tradition from the old country." Agnes nodded, the slow nod of a woman filing information into a place where it would stay. Then she said, "Why are you doing this instead of signing his paper?" Nell had not prepared for that question. She had prepared for questions about materials and method and whether the timeline was possible. She had not prepared for the question that looked straight at her. She opened her mouth and then closed it again and looked at her own hands on the table, the raw skin at the base of each finger where the shovel had been, the dirt still in the creases of her knuckles. She gave the answer that was true. "My name is on the deed," she said. "Not just Roy's, mine. And Victor Caldwell is building a case using numbers that are not what Roy agreed to. I worked in a courthouse for 12 years. I know the difference between an honest ledger and a manufactured one. He is doing this to more than me. There are other widows in this territory. There are other women sitting at tables right now, reading papers that do not say what their husbands were told they said." She stopped. She had not meant to say all of that. It had come out the way things come out when you have been holding them for 6 weeks and someone asks the right question. She looked up. Agnes was looking at her with an expression Nell could not fully read. Not quite assessment, not quite recognition. Something between the two. Agnes pushed back from the table. Her chair scraped the floor with a sound like a statement. She walked to the window and stood there with her back to Nell, looking out at the bare yard and the corral where the horse stood quiet and the flat gray sky that was making its preparations. When she spoke, she did not turn around. "Cyrus Caldwell," she said, "Victor's father. He took 40 acres of my husband Thomas's bottomland in 1878. The arithmetic he brought to me after Thomas died did not survive scrutiny, but by the time I had the records organized to prove it, his filing was already entered at the territorial clerk's office. The clerk told me the matter was settled. The clerk did not meet my eyes when he said it." A pause. Thomas was not confused about his own finances. Thomas was the least confused man I have ever known. He kept records the way other men keep faith, carefully and because it mattered. Another pause. "I have a son in Bismarck. He wants me to come live with him." "I will not. This was Thomas's land first and mine now. I will not leave it." She turned around. In the kitchen light with the window behind her, her face had a clarity to it that Nell had not seen before. The face of a woman who has arrived at the place where there is nothing left to be careful about. "I am going to help you," Agnes said. "Not because I am certain you can do this. I am going to help you because I have been waiting 8 years to watch that family be wrong about something that cannot be explained away." She crossed to the hook by the door and took down a man's wool coat worn thin at the elbows. The coat of a man who had worn it for many years before it passed into the keeping of the woman who stored it, and wore it now with the practiced efficiency of someone who dressed for work every morning, regardless of the weather. "Drink your coffee," Agnes said. "Then we will go look at your hole." Nell picked up the cup with both hands. It was warm all the way through her palms. Outside the window, a thin line of cloud was moving in from the northwest with the patient deliberation of something that has not yet decided to hurry. They reached the marsh proper by mid-morning. Agnes did not speak much on the walk south. When she did speak, it was to ask specific questions. She asked about the dimensions of the barn. She asked about the pitch of the roof and whether Roy had used green lumber or seasoned. She asked whether the cellar door had come up with force or with ease and what the smell had been when it opened. Nell answered each question carefully, understanding that she was being evaluated, that Agnes was building a picture in her mind of what was down there before she agreed to look at it. By the time they crossed the yard toward the barn, Agnes had stopped asking. She simply looked at the structure the way a doctor looks at a patient before saying anything. She studied the roof line, the corner joinery, the way the barn sat on the ground. Then she walked inside, took the lantern from the hook near the door without asking, and crossed to where the cellar door lay in the packed earth floor. She did not go down immediately. She crouched at the edge of the opening, which Nell had levered back up and propped open with a piece of framing the lumber before they left that morning. Agnes lowered the lantern into the darkness below and looked for a long time. Her face was still and attentive. The lamplight caught the lines around her eyes and the gray of her hair and the particular quality of concentration she gave to everything she looked at, which was total and unhurried. Then she said, "Help me up." Nell helped her up. Agnes's knees made a sound that was a conversation between old bones and cold mornings. She straightened and brushed the dirt from her coat and looked at Nell. "It is a real cellar," she said. "Yes, built by someone who knew what they were doing. Ezra Whitmore. He left in '79. Agnes was quiet for a moment. People said he gave up, that he was not strong enough for this country. That was what Nell had heard too. Agnes looked back at the opening. "I am revising that assessment," she said. She walked the lantern around the perimeter of the opening, studying the shape and the dimensions, looking at the angle of the stairs cut into the earth and effaced with flat stones. Then she turned to Nell. "You first," she said. "I will not go down those steps until I know they hold." The steps held. Of course they held. They had been cut into stable earth and faced with stone by a man who built what he intended to last. Nell went down first, the lantern warm in her hand, her boots finding the stone risers one at a time, and she stood at the bottom and held the light up. She heard Agnes come down behind her, the deliberate sound of boots on stone, a small sound of effort at the last step, then the soft impact of Agnes landing on the cellar floor. Then a silence that lasted long enough that Nell turned to look. Agnes was standing with one hand on the cellar wall and her head tilted back, looking up at the brick arch of the ceiling. Her face had changed entirely. The evaluating quality was gone. What had replaced it was something older and more private. The look of a person who has opened a door they did not expect and found something they had not seen in a very long time. "My grandmother Agnes," said, quietly speaking to the ceiling rather than to Nell. "My grandmother in Ohio had a cellar like this. Smaller, same arch, same kind of brick. We put up apples in it every fall. Those apples would still be sweet in March when everything else had been eaten or gone bad." She lowered her hand. She turned and looked at Nell, and her eyes were bright in the lamplight in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "I have not thought about that cellar in 50 years, she said. She wiped her eyes once quickly with the back of her hand, the way you wipe a smudge off a window, a gesture that acknowledged something and moved past it in the same motion. Then she turned back to the cellar and went to work. She walked every wall. She pressed the brick of the arched ceiling with the handle of the trowel she had carried in her coat pocket, listening to the sound it made tapping at intervals, the way a doctor taps a chest. She moved from corner to corner, and when she reached the northeast corner, she stopped and crouched down and ran one finger along a long seam where the mortar had failed between the stones. "Here," she said. Nell had already seen it, about 20 inches across and 18 inches vertically. The stones had not shifted. The arch above was holding them in place. But water was coming through the soil behind, seeping slowly through the gap in the mortar, and if that continued through a hard winter, the seepage would become something more serious. Agnes straightened up. "Here's what we need," she said. "Clay sand lime. Clay first. Where do I find clay?" "South of your property. Walk the creek until the bank turns red. Dig there. Bring buckets. Bring more buckets than you think you need." Agnes brought lime the next morning before the sun was fully up. She arrived at Nell's gate with a sack of lime powder balanced across her saddle and her expression already set for work. She did not say good morning. She swung down from the horse, lifted the sack, and said, "Did you get the clay?" Nell had gotten the clay. She had walked the creek south the previous afternoon and found the red bank where Agnes said it would be, a deep, rust-colored seam in the soil at a bend in the creek, dense and slick, and considerably heavier than it looked. She had filled 6 buckets and carried them back one at a time, 2 at a time, when she could manage it, until her arms had moved past pain into a trembling that was its own separate condition. The clay sat in Roy's old wash tub in the barn, covered with a piece of sacking to keep it workable. Agnes looked at the wash tub. She looked at the amount of clay. She said, "This will do for today." They worked for 4 days. The process was precise and unforgiving. As all physical work at this scale is precise and unforgiving, meaning that mistakes made in the first hours became problems in the final hours, and there was no shortcut that did not announce itself later. Agnes mixed the mortar in a wooden trough. Lime sand water worked together by hand until the consistency was exactly what it needed to be, which was not a measurement Agnes could name in numbers, but could demonstrate with her palm. The first morning, Nell asked what the proportions were. Agnes held up her hand, gray with the mix. "This is the proportion," she said. "Watch my hands and your eyes will learn it." Nell watched. By the 3rd day, she could look at the trough and know when the mix needed more sand. The knowledge came into her hands before it came into her mind, which was how Agnes had said it would happen. And the fact that it was happening made Nell understand something about the difference between being told a thing and learning it through the body, which is a difference that cannot be crossed any other way. While Agnes worked the mortar into the joints with the long, smooth strokes of someone who had been doing this since before Nell was born, Nell packed clay behind the damaged section of wall. She pressed it into the gap between the stones and the soil behind them, using a flat board, forcing it into every crevice until the seepage slowed and then stopped. The mortar had to be kept from freezing before it cured, which Agnes solved with a method that was both brutal and simple. She had Nell build a small fire in a metal bucket at the base of the wall, just enough heat to keep the air around the curing mortar above freezing. This meant the fire had to be tended through the night. Nell slept in 2-hour intervals on a mattress she dragged down from the cabin. She woke to the small alarm of her own body, which had learned quickly what 2 hours felt like. And she fed the bucket fire and checked the mortar with her bare hand and sealed things back up and slept again until the next 2 hours were done. On the third night, Agnes stayed late. They sat together in the cellar by the bucket fire, the two of them, while the smoke climbed the stairwell into the barn above, and the frost outside made the boards contract and settle with sounds like distant conversation. Agnes reached into her coat pocket and produced a glass jar. She unscrewed the lid with her broad, cracked fingers and offered it across. Inside, floating in their own pale syrup, were pear halves. Canned in August, she said, "I am not modest about my pears." She handed Nell a fork, and they ate from the brush in the underground silence. The only sounds a small crackle of the bucket fire and the distant adjustment of timber above them. The pears were sweet in the particular way that home-canned fruit is sweet, which is not the sweetness of sugar, but the sweetness of a summer that has been saved. Nell said, "Tell me about Thomas." She had not planned to ask. It arrived the way certain questions arrive, fully formed, as though they had been waiting. Agnes did not look up from the jar. She speared a pear half and ate it slowly. "Thomas was a quiet man," she said. "Quieter than I am. People assumed I married him because I needed someone to listen. There was some truth in that, but mostly I married him because he had the kindest hands I had ever seen on a person. A man's words will say one thing and mean another. His hands you can read plainly." "How long were you married?" Nell said. 26 years. And then a horse went wrong over a fence and Thomas was on the wrong side of the horse when it came down. And that was the end of 26 years. She was quiet for a moment. 26 years and then no years. Just like that. The clock keeps going, the day keeps arriving. But you walk around inside your own house and you cannot remember which side of the bed was yours. Nell knew exactly what she meant. She had been sleeping on Roy's side since the second night after the funeral, not because she had decided to, but because she had lain down in the dark and her body had moved to where the warmth was, and Roy's side of the bed had still been slightly warmer than hers, and she had stayed there. Agnes offered the jar again. Nell took one more pear. "The pain does not go away," Agnes said. "I will not tell you it goes away because people told me that, and it was not useful. What happens is it finds a place inside you to sit down. It stops walking around breaking things, and it sits down. And eventually you get used to sitting in the same room with it." The bucket fire popped, a small adjustment in the burning wood. The cellar held its warmth steadily, the brick arch above them doing what it had always been designed to do, containing and reflecting and returning. On the morning of the fourth day, Agnes pressed her thumb into the mortar joint she had finished first, and the mortar held. She nodded once with the particular economy of a woman who does not perform satisfaction but allows it. "Wall is good," she said. "Now you do the floor." The floor was the heart of what her mother's journal had described. Everything else was shelter. The floor was the system. Agnes explained it standing in the center of the cellar with her arms crossed and her voice even. And Nell listened the way she had learned to listen in the courthouse for the structure underneath the words, for what the sequence of information revealed about how things actually worked. "Most people think stone is cold," Agnes said. "Stone is not cold. Stone is patient. Stone takes whatever temperature you give. It holds, it gives it back slowly. A granite floor properly charged with heat becomes a stove that burns no fuel. It only remembers." "Where do I find granite?" Nell said. Agnes looked at her. "Walk your west fence line," she said. "You are sitting on enough granite to build a courthouse. The glaciers carried it here and left it, and all you have to do is carry it the rest of the way." She left that afternoon. At the edge of the property, she turned in the saddle and looked back at Nell standing at the barn door. "Lay your straw insulation first. Then start with the heaviest stones and work outward. Do not try to lift what you cannot lift. And eat something, Eleanor Marsh, even when you do not want to eat." Nell said she would. Agnes turned north and was gone. It was on the walk back from the west fence line on the second day of carrying granite that Nathan Briggs appeared on the road. She did not know him well. She had seen him twice at Hendrick's store, a lean young man with watchful eyes who worked for Victor Caldwell and who had the manner of someone paying careful attention to more than what was directly in front of him. He rode up to the edge of her property and stopped. He did not enter the gate. He sat on his horse and looked at her, and then he looked at the cart loaded with granite, and then he looked at the excavated dirt beside the barn, and he did not ask about any of it. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, "I came to tell you something. I am not here on Mr. Caldwell's behalf." She waited. Mr. Caldwell filed a preliminary notice with the territorial clerk on the 3rd of November. An abandonment notice. If he can demonstrate that you are not actively residing on the property, no regular smoke from the chimney, no evidence of daily habitation, he can petition for early recovery of the land without waiting for the December deadline. Nell set down the handle of the cart. "The abandonment statute," Nathan said, "it does not require your signature or your consent. It only requires evidence." She asked him why he was telling her this. He looked at the ground. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that means a person is deciding how much of a true thing to say. "Mr. Caldwell did the same thing to my brother's family in 1882, he said. "My brother went to Bismarck for a week to look for work. When he came back, the abandonment notice was already filed and entered. He lost the property by spring." Nell waited. "My brother died in 1885, Nathan said. He said it with the flatness of someone who has said a thing so many times it has become a fact rather than a grief, though underneath the flatness, the grief was still there. She could hear it the way you hear a river through ice." She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. "And then because it was true, I am sorry about your brother." Nathan put his hat back on. He turned the horse east. He did not look back. From that morning forward, Nell lit a fire in the cabin stove every day at first light. She used the smallest amount of wood that would produce visible smoke from the chimney. Just enough. Just the signature of a woman living her life in her home. Then she closed the damper, crossed the yard, entered the barn, and descended. The cabin was a performance. The chimney was the proof, the cellar was the life. The west fence line yielded granite in everything from the size of a bread loaf to the size of a butter churn. Ezra Whitmore had built that fence from the stones the glaciers left, and it was a solid wall of exactly the material her mother's journal required. Dense, slow to heat, slower to cool. Patient in exactly the way Agnes had described. Nell carried the smaller stones by hand. The larger ones she loaded two at a time onto Roy's handcart, the small flat cart he had built for hauling fence materials, which had good solid wheels and a handle that fit her grip. She dragged the cart across the frozen yard and into the barn, and lowered each stone into the cellar using a rope sling fashioned from the coil she found in an old wooden crate near the back wall of the cellar, a crate with the initials E.W. burned into the lid. Ezra Whitmore's crate. She used his rope to lower his stones into his cellar. She thought about that while she worked. She thought about the man who had built all of this and then been told to leave it. She thought about what it cost a person to build something carefully and then have it taken away, and she thought about the fact that what he had built had waited here in the dark for 10 years for someone who would understand what it was for. The work of lowering the stones was the hardest physical labor she had encountered since the clay. It demanded a kind of sustained effort that expanded just past the edge of what she thought she could do, and then expanded again as though the work had its own intelligence about how much a person actually contained. Her hands cracked open at the base of each finger. She wrapped them in strips torn from an old shirt and kept working. Her back developed a pain between the shoulder blades that woke her each morning before the alarm of her own body did a sharp particular pain that was not wrong exactly, only honest. She laid the stones over a bed of dry straw in the spacing Agnes had taught her. Tight, the gaps no wider than a knife blade. She worked outward from the center, placing each stone with the attention she had once given to filing documents, making sure each piece was in the right relationship to everything around it. 4 days for the floor. It was on the morning of the 5th day when the floor was complete, and she was kneeling on the newly laid granite, checking the final corner, that she heard Agnes come down the stairs behind her. She had not heard Agnes arrive. She looked up, and there was the older woman standing on the completed stone floor, with her hand on the wall, turning slowly to look at the whole of what they had made. Her face again had that quality Nell had seen before the first time she came down here, the recognition. "My grandmother's cellar," Agnes said. She said it quietly, not to Nell, but to some interior listener. "Same floor, same weight under your feet." She walked the perimeter. She checked the joints between the stones with the trowel. She crouched in the corners and examined the seams. Then she stood in the center of the floor and looked up at the brick arch and nodded once. "Now we need the window," she said. "And the stove arrangement." The southern window was the most demanding piece of the remaining work. Her mother's journal specified an angled excavation on the south side of the barn, sloping downward from ground level to the cellar wall cut at 22 degrees from horizontal, deep enough to seat a glazed surface nearly flat, capturing the low winter sun. Too steep and the light would pass over the glass. Too shallow and the snow would pile on it and seal it. She dug for 4 days. The ground at the surface was frozen and had to be broken in thin slices with the tip of the shovel before it would yield at all. Below 4 inches, it became dense cold clay, heavy and resistant, each shovel load requiring the full engagement of her back and arms, and whatever reserve she was drawing from somewhere she had not previously known she had. Each load had to be carried up the stairs and out. Each day began in darkness and ended in darkness. She ate standing at the stove, cold oats from a tin cup. She slept in the cellar on the stone floor that was not yet charged with heat, wrapped in every blanket she owned, and she woke with the morning still black outside and went back to work. It was the second day of the window excavation when Agnes fell. They had finished his morning's work on the ramp and were walking together toward the west fence line to look at the remaining granite when Agnes's boot found a patch of black ice hidden under a thin skim of blown snow. The ice was invisible. The snow had covered it cleanly, and there was no warning. Agnes went down on her right side with a swiftness that left no time for catching herself, and the sound that came from her wrist when she landed was a small, distinct crack that carried in the cold air with terrible clarity. Nell was at her side in 3 strides. Agnes was sitting on the frozen ground, cradling her right arm against her chest, her face the color of old paper. Her breath coming in controlled, shallow pulls, the breathing of a person managing severe pain with the discipline of long practice. "That is broken," Nell said. "Help me up," Agnes said. "The ground is cold." Nell helped her up. She walked her slowly across the yard and into the cabin and sat her at the table. She found 2 flat pieces of firewood and a long strip of cotton sheeting she tore from an old pillowcase, and she splinted the wrists the way she had once seen a doctor do it, placing the wood along either side, wrapping firmly from below the break to above, it tying it off with a knot that would hold without cutting. Agnes sat through all of this without speaking, her left hand flat on the table, her eyes closed. When it was done, she opened her eyes. "You will need to send word to my son, David in Bismarck," she said. "He will come for me." "Agnes," the word came out sharper than Nell intended, sharp enough that Agnes looked at her directly. "Do not say what you are about to say," Agnes said. "I know what this means. I have been calculating it since I hit the ground. You have 14 days, the wall is done, the floor is done, the window trench still needs 2 more days. The stove arrangement, the charging test. Nell said I know what is left. Agnes said the question is whether you can do it alone. I can do it." She said it without performance. She said it the way Agnes had said, "The wall is good," with the flatness of a woman stating what she has assessed. Agnes looked at her for a long time. The look of a woman who has spent 72 years reading the difference between what people say and what they can actually do. "I believe you can," she said at last. "I also believe this is the most dangerous thing I have seen a woman attempt alone in 30 years on this prairie." She stood carefully holding her right arm against her coat. She walked to the door. At the threshold, she turned back. "The southern window," she said, 22 degrees, not 20, not 24. If you are not sure, cut a piece of board to the angle and hold it against the ramp. Your eye is not calibrated for degrees. The board will tell you what your eye cannot. "Yes," Nell said, "and eat something every day. More than oats." "Yes." Agnes stepped outside. Her silhouette moved north across the frozen yard, smaller against the pale sky, her right arm held against her body, her left arm swinging with the ordinary rhythm of a woman walking home, until the distance took her and she was gone. Nell stood in the cabin doorway and watched the empty yard. She gave herself exactly 5 minutes. She counted them on the clock above the stove, the clock Roy had carried from Minnesota in a wooden box packed with wool and had hung on the cabin wall the first morning they had a wall to hang it on. She watched the minute hand, and she let herself feel what she was feeling, which was fear. Not the surface fear of difficulty, but the deeper kind. The fear of being alone in this, in the most literal sense of being the only person who knew what needed to happen, and whether it was happening correctly with no one to check the angle or feel the mortar, or tell her the proportion was right. 5 minutes. She picked up the shovel and went back to work on the southern trench. She cut a piece of board to 22 degrees the way Agnes had told her. She held it against the ramp and adjusted until the board lay flush, and then she kept digging at that angle, measuring again every few passes to make sure she had not drifted. It was the kind of precise, sustained attention that she had given to documents in the courthouse, the understanding that a small error early in a process becomes a large error later, and that the time to catch it is always at the beginning. She reached the south cellar wall on the fourth day of digging. Roy had ordered window sashes the previous spring, two of them double-paned with brass hardware intended for the permanent house he had been planning to build around them. The house they had talked about every winter since the children left. The house with the proper kitchen and the room for a loom and the window seat above the garden. The house that had been a plan and then a promise and then a postponement and then in September, something that would never be built at all. The sashes were stored in the corner of the barn wrapped in burlap. Nell unwrapped them on the 22nd of November. She held the first one up to catch the light coming through the barn boards, and the glass was clean and clear, and the brass hardware caught the light and glinted, and she held it for a long time. Roy had touched this. His hands had carried this from the freight wagon where it arrived, and had set it in this corner, and had smoothed the burlap wrapping with the particular care he gave to things he valued. His hands were on this glass. She was going to put this glass in the ground. She was going to lay the window he had ordered for the house above their bed into an angled ramp cut into the cold earth below a barn floor. She was going to take the thing he had imagined one way and make it into something different, something that might save her life in a way he could not have imagined, because he had not known he was going to leave her with no choice but to imagine it herself. "I am sorry," she said quietly to the glass to Roy, "to the house that would not be built." And then she set the sash in the frame she had constructed from barn lumber, and she packed the joints with clay and straw, and the next morning when the sun came through at the angle she had worked 4 days to achieve, a broad stripe of winter light appeared on the granite floor of the cellar for the first time. It moved. Slowly as the sun moved, the parallelogram of light tracked across the stone floor, touching each piece of granite it crossed and warming it. By mid-afternoon, the stones that had been in direct sun were perceptibly warmer than those at the edges. She pressed her palm flat against one of them and held it there. The warmth was mild, but it was real. It was not heat from a fire. It was stored light, sunlight captured through glass and held in stone. It was her mother's principle made actual and present under her hands, and it worked. She cleared the old ventilation flue on the 24th. A full day of uncomfortable close work, lying on her back with her arms overhead, pulling out 10 years of debris. Packed earth, dried leaves, the skeleton of something small that had come down from above and not found its way back out. When the last obstruction came free, she felt a draft, faint but real, moving down the flue from the barn above. She built the damper for the flue from a flat stone and a leather hinge. She tested it twice. It opened and closed cleanly. Then came the arrangement for the rendering pot. Roy had bought the large cast-iron rendering pot 3 years earlier for reasons that had made sense at the time and had never fully materialized. It sat in the corner of the barn like a monument to intentions, massive and black, impractical in its design, if not in its current use. Moving it was not possible through ordinary means. She built 2 log rollers from pieces of the framing lumber and used the same mechanical principles she had used on the cellar door, and she rolled the pot inch by inch across the barn floor to the position directly above the cellar opening. She built a platform for it from the heaviest barn timber she had. She tested the platform with her own weight, and then with 2 of the heaviest granite stones she could find, and then she rolled the pot onto it using the logs and a good deal of patience, and the understanding that hurrying this part would be costly. Above the pot, she cut a 6-inch hole in the barn roof. Below it, she left the corresponding opening in the cellar ceiling. When the pot was fired, the heat would descend. The floor would receive it. The floor would hold it. The system was complete. On the 26th of November, she was ready for the first test. She filled the rendering pot with broken fence rails and small branches, every piece of dry wood she had been collecting from the fence line and the woodpile for 2 weeks. She struck the flint over the tinder at the base. The tinder caught. The small flame found the kindling and climbed. She stood in the barn and watched it grow. The wood caught fully, and the flames climbed the interior of the iron vessel, and the heat began to build in the body of the pot. With the slow, powerful accumulation that heavy iron produces, the black walls going dark red at the base, and the color climbing the sides like a tide. Smoke poured upward through the hole in the roof. She went below. She stood at the bottom of the cellar stairs and tilted her face up toward the opening above. The heat came down in a column that was dry and powerful, and smelled of iron and burning wood, and it pressed against her face and her closed eyes, and she stood in it for a long time. She kept the fire burning for 3 hours. When it died, she sealed the cellar opening with the heavy stone slab she had prepared and shaped and fitted to the frame. She sat on the bed in the underground dark, and she waited. The temperature climbed, 50 degrees, then 55, then 60. Over the following 2 hours, the cellar stabilized at 63 degrees Fahrenheit, and the warmth was not like the warmth of a stove, which is fierce and directional and demands to be maintained. It was like the warmth of a room that has been warm all day, even and ambient and rising from the floor as much as from the air. Rising from the stone that had received the heat and was now returning it on its own schedule, on the slow schedule of dense matter that has been asked to remember. She lay on the mattress that night with the heat coming up through the floor beneath her, into her back, into her shoulders, into the deep cold that had been living in her joints since October, and she pressed her hands flat against the stone beside her and felt it giving back what it had been given steadily without hurry. She thought about her mother writing those pages in the journal. She thought about what it meant to leave a thing behind for someone you would never meet, a drawing of principle, a record of what worked, trusting that eventually someone would open the trunk and find it and understand what it was for. She thought about Ezra Whitmore building this cellar and this floor and these stairs and leaving them sealed in the ground when he was pushed off his land, leaving them intact, leaving them for someone who would know what to do with them. She thought about Roy, about the night they lit their first fire in this cabin, sitting on the floor together with no furniture yet, and the fire new and everything new. About the way he had said it, looking at his hands, the words going quietly into the air between them, so they would not scatter. You are stronger than you know, Nell. I am only the lucky one who gets to watch. She lay on the warm stone floor of her cellar on the 26th of November, and she looked up at the brick arch above her by candlelight, and she thought, I know now, Roy. I know where it is. Then the rendering pot cracked. It happened on the 29th of November, 2 days before the 1st of December deadline, when the temperature outside dropped to 25 below zero overnight, and the barn timbers popped in the cold with sounds like shots fired at a distance. She had built the evening fire in the pot at dusk as usual, carefully the way she always built it, and the thermal shock found the flaw that had been invisible in the casting, a hairline weakness in the iron that had never mattered before and mattered now completely. The crack ran from the rim to the base in one irreversible split. The sound reached her below as a single wrong note, a tone that was wrong for wood and wrong for stone, and she came up the stairs and found the pot split open like a dark fruit, the fire dying inside it, the heat escaping sideways rather than descending. She stood in the cold barn and looked at it. She did not panic. Something in her had moved past the place where panic lived. She stood and she looked at the ruined pot and she thought through what she actually had. She went below. She opened her mother's journal and read the section on heat charging for the 5th time since she had started this work. She read it the way you read a map when you are lost looking for the feature that matches where you actually are. Then she looked at the 2 smaller cast iron vessels against the cellar wall. Roy's Dutch oven and the deep skillet that had come with them from Minnesota and that she had cooked in for 38 years. Together they held perhaps a quarter of the volume of the rendering pot. Separately they were manageable. She carried them both upstairs. She built 2 small platforms from the remaining framing lumber, one on each side of the cellar opening. She set the pots on them and built separate small fires in each careful fires attended. Fires that she fed by hand for 4 hours while crouching in the coal barn in the dark. The heat output was a fraction of what the rendering pot had given, but it was concentrated. 2 narrow columns of warmth descending from 2 points, spreading across the stone floor from 2 separate sources. She went below and she measured with her thermometer, the small glass thermometer Roy had used for monitoring grain storage, and she read 60 degrees on the floor after 3 hours. Adequate? Enough. The margin was thinner. She would need to fire the pots every 2 days instead of every 3. She would burn more wood. The system was not what she had designed. It was what she had instead. The system held. It was on the afternoon of the same day, while she was digging the final section of the southern ramp to clear a drainage channel, that the shovel blade hit something that was not stone and not dirt and not frozen clay. She stopped. She cleared the soil with her hands, sweeping it back in slow, careful strokes. Wood. A flat piece of wood fitted tightly against the cellar's south foundation. Too deliberate to be accidental, too well positioned to be debris. She worked along the edge with her fingers. A fitted panel, a door small no more than 2 feet by 2 feet, set into a shallow recess in the original cellar wall. She would not have found it if she had not been cutting this exact drainage channel at this exact depth. She would have missed it by 6 inches. She got the flat of the trowel into the seam and pried carefully. The panel came loose from the decade of packed earth and cold that held it with a sound like a held breath being released. Behind it was a small chamber, perhaps 18 inches deep, cut directly into the south foundation of the cellar. Inside the chamber was a wooden box sealed with wax along every seam, the wax brown and hard with age. She lifted the box out with both hands. Inside the box, wrapped in a piece of oilskin that had kept its integrity through 10 winters, were 2 things. The first was a notebook, small. The cover had no marking except the initials E pressed into the leather. Inside, in a cramped, practical hand that belonged to a man who wrote down what mattered and left out everything else, were notes on the construction of the cellar. Measurements, the weight-bearing calculations for the arch, the source of the limestone for the mortar. And at the back, in the same hand, but written faster, pressed harder into the page, the last several entries. She read them. Ezra Whitmore had not left this land because he was weak. He had not failed. He had been pushed. A man named Harlan Caldwell, Victor's father, the same family, the same methods, the same manufactured debt, and the same patient pressure, had forced him out in the winter of 1879. Whitmore had seen it coming. He had prepared the hidden chamber. He had left the notebook because he understood something that she felt now in her hands, like a current passing through the paper. He had written on the last page in letters larger than the rest, "This cellar is for whoever comes next. The land deserves someone who will stay." The second thing in the box was a small cloth bag tied with a piece of twine sealed with a second layer of wax. She broke the wax and opened the bag, and inside were seeds. Corn seed, dry and hard and sealed against moisture and cold. Seeds from 1879 waiting. She sat down on the stone floor of the cellar. She sat down, and she did not try to stop what was coming. She let it come. She pressed both hands flat against the warm granite floor, and she put her face down against the stone, and she wept. She wept for Roy and for Ezra Whitmore, and for her mother who had written the pages that brought her here, and for every woman who had sat on land she had every right to keep and been told it was time to go. She wept until she was done. Then she lifted her face. The candle burned straight. The warm stone was solid under her palms. The floor she had built was holding its heat, holding it the way the earth holds summer, the way the living hold the memory of the dead, steadily and without drama, because that is what depth does. It holds what the surface is too thin to keep. She set the bag of seeds carefully in the corner of the cellar, in the driest spot, and she put the notebook on the shelf beside her mother's journal. She climbed the stairs. She had 2 days. The morning of the 1st of December arrived the way certain mornings arrive on the northern plains, without ceremony, without any light, worth calling. Light, the sky simply going from black to gray to a pale and non-committal white, that offered nothing and withheld nothing, only the cold which had settled into the territory, now the way a long-term occupant settles in rearranging things to suit itself. Nell was up before the gray arrived. She lit the cabin stove at first light with 3 full logs, real ones. Not the small gesture of smoke she had been making each morning for weeks. She wanted the cabin chimney to be producing proper smoke when Caldwell came up the road. She swept the floor. She opened the shutters. She set the kitchen table with 2 cups because her mother had taught her that the way you set a table tells a person what you think of the meeting, and she wanted Caldwell to understand that she had been expecting him and had prepared accordingly. Then she left the cabin. She crossed the yard and went into the barn, and she descended into the cellar, and she fired both small pots on their platforms for 2 full hours, attending them with the focused patience she had developed over these weeks, feeding each fire at the intervals that kept it hot, without burning fast, until the cellar temperature had climbed to 62 degrees and she could feel the heat rising through the stone floor beneath her feet with the steady, quiet generosity of something that had been storing this gift since autumn. Then she sealed both pots. She climbed the stairs. She brought the wooden stool down from the cabin and placed it directly over the sealed cellar opening. She sat down on it. She set her mother's journal in her lap and folded her hands on the cover. She could feel the warmth through the soles of her boots. She waited. She heard the horse at 10 in the morning. One horse. She had wondered whether he would bring the younger man again, Nathan Briggs on his second horse, saying nothing and watching everything. He did not. He came alone this time, which told her something about how he had arranged this visit in his own mind, whether as a business call or as something else. She heard him try the cabin first. She heard him knock and wait and knock again. She heard the silence that followed. Then she heard his boots cross the frozen yard toward the barn. He came through the barn door with the particular posture of a man who has prepared himself, who has been preparing since he got on the horse 2 miles east of here, and rode west through the cold with his leather satchel against his ribs and his speech organized in his head. He was wearing the expensive coat. He was wearing the hat. He looked like a man who understood the value of presentation. He stopped. He stopped in the barn doorway and looked at her sitting on the stool in her dead husband's coat with the journal in her lap and the particular quality of stillness around her that was not performed stillness, but the real kind. The stillness of a person who has been waiting calmly for something to arrive and feels no urgency now that it has. He stepped into the barn. And then he felt it. She watched him feel it. She watched it register in his body before it reached his face, the way his stride changed slightly, the way he slowed, the way his expression shifted from the arranged sympathy he had brought through the door to something unguarded and uncertain. He had been building structures in this territory for 19 years. He had walked through every kind of barn and cabin and storage shed in Dakota. He had never felt warmth coming up from a barn floor in December. He took 2 more steps and stopped again. She could see the moment he crossed from the cold air near the door into the warmer air above the cellar opening. It was visible on him. The change in temperature was visible as a physical event. He looked at her. She looked at him. She did not smile. She did not speak first. "Mr. Caldwell," she said after a moment. "Mrs. Marsh." He said it with his prepared warmth, but the warmth was doing something different than it usually did. It was covering uncertainty rather than confidence. "You are here on the date we agreed upon." "I am," he said. He held the satchel against his ribs. She had counted the times she had seen him do that. 4. She had watched him carry that satchel to her fence line and to her porch and to this barn, as though the papers inside it were the last solid thing in an uncertain situation. She understood the gesture now in a way she had not the first time she saw it. A man holds tight to what he believes will resolve things. "I have come to collect your signature," he said. "I know why you are here, Mr. Caldwell. I have known for 35 days. He was quiet. She could see him recalibrating again, the way he had recalibrated on her porch in October, when she told him 11 minutes. He had come prepared for several versions of this conversation. He had not prepared for the version where she was sitting on a wooden stool in a coal barn, radiating warmth from beneath her feet. He looked at the floor around her. He looked at the stone slab she was sitting above. He looked at her hands on the journal. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I have helped 14 families survive winters in this territory. The ones who made it through did it with stoves and firewood and walls thick enough to hold the heat. The ones who did not." He stopped. She finished it for him. "Are buried out there with my husband," she said, "or gone east with your money in their pockets telling themselves they chose to go." His jaw moved. She had learned to read his jaw. It moved when he was processing something that did not fit the categories he had built. "That is not an accurate characterization," he said. "It is the most accurate characterization I have," she said. "I spent 12 years in a courthouse reading documents. I know the difference between a conclusion and a fact. You present conclusions as facts, Mr. Caldwell. You have been doing it since the first morning you sat on your horse at my fence line and did not come down. The barn was quiet. Outside, a light wind moved through the space between the boards with a thin, cold sound. Somewhere above them in the rafters, something shifted, a bird or a draft or the building settling into its own weight. Show me, Caldwell said. Show him. She looked at him. Whatever you have done, he said. Whatever is under this floor. I want to see it. He said it quietly and without the warmth he usually carried. He said it the way a man asks a question he is not certain he wants answered. Nell set the journal carefully on the upturned bucket beside her stool. She stood up. She bent and gripped the iron ring set into the stone slab and pulled, and the slab came sideways with the low scraping sound she had heard so many times now. It had become as ordinary as opening a door. The warm air rose past her in a column, past her face, past her hair rising into the cold barn above and spreading outward. It rose past Caldwell's face. He stood and looked down into the opening. She watched him look. She watched him take in the granite floor and the repaired wall and the brick arch and the small bed with its quilts folded back. She watched him see the provisions stacked neatly along the far wall, the candle in its brass holder, the two journals on the small shelf of board she had fitted between two stones. She watched him see the southern window she had cut into the foundation, the double-pane glass Roy had ordered for the house they had planned, now set at its careful angle, letting in the flat winter light in a pale parallelogram that moved slowly across the stone floor as the morning progressed. She watched him see Roy's brown wool coat hanging on the iron hook in the corner. He looked at all of this for what she judged to be about a full minute. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they have been told does not exist and which is existing plainly in front of them. Then he looked at her. Who built this, he said. I did. Who helped you? Agnes Polk. Something moved in his face at that name. A specific movement, not general surprise, but the recognition of a particular thing. She had been told that Caldwell had a specific response to the name Agnes Polk. She understood now what that response was. It was the look of a man confronting a debt he has been not paying for a long time. You and Agnes Polk, he said. Yes. Built this. He gestured at the cellar below them. Yes. In 34 days, the first day she said was burying my husband. She said it without heat. She said it the way you state a figure in a ledger because it is accurate and needs to be in the record. He took a step back from the opening. He was holding the satchel in front of him now, rather than against his ribs, holding it the way a person holds something they are not sure what to do with. She watched him look at the cellar one more time. She watched his face go through something she could not entirely read. Something that had several layers to it, the practical layer and the layer underneath the practical one, and the layer underneath that which she was not sure he had visited recently. This does not change the debt, he said at last. I did not ask it to, she said. It does not change the deadline. I did not ask it to. It does not change the fact that January has not happened yet, that the worst weeks of a Dakota winter are still ahead of you. He paused. This is impressive work, Mrs. Marsh. I will not pretend it is not. But this is November's answer. January is a different question. Nell looked at him steadily. Then I suppose we will see, she said. He opened the satchel. He took out the deed transfer document she had been watching him carry for 35 days. He looked at the unsigned line. He folded the paper in half. He folded it in half again. He put it back in the satchel and buckled the flap. I will return, he said, after the first real storm. If you are still here, we will talk again. She watched him walk out of the barn. She heard his horse move east down the road. She stood at the barn door and watched him until the distance reduced him to a dark shape and then to nothing against the pale horizon. Then she went below and closed the slab above her and lay on her bed in the warm underground dark and thought about what January would actually ask of her. December came the way December comes to the northern plains. Not all at once, but in degrees, the temperature dropping by small, reliable increments each day until the cold was no longer a condition of the air, but a weight the air carried. Nell lived underground. She lived by the rhythm of the floor and the arc of the southern light across the granite in the interval of the fires she built every second day in the two small cast iron pots above. She rationed her books the way she rationed the salt pork. She read 3 pages of Emerson in the morning and 3 pages of the novel in the evening, and let the poetry be something she came to only on the days when the solitude pressed hardest. She thought about Agnes. She thought about Roy. She thought about her mother writing in the journal by lamplight in a Minnesota kitchen, drawing the cross-sections with the careful slant of her educated hand, leaving them for someone she would never know. She thought about Ezra Whitmore. She thought about him often down here in the cellar he had built, sleeping above the floor he had laid, moving through the space his hands had shaped. She had read his notebook through twice since she found it. She knew the measurements and the calculations and the sourcing notes. She also knew the last pages, the fast, hard writing of a man who understood he was running out of time to say the things that needed to be said. She had placed his notebook on the shelf beside her mother's journal, the two of them together. The woman who recorded what to build and the man who built the thing that waited to be found. She thought there was a conversation between those two books that did not require her to translate it. The cold outside reached 32 below on the 28th of December. She knew this because Nathan Briggs had stopped at her gate 3 days before Christmas with a note from Agnes, who had said she was mending and would come in spring, and who had included a note from the Hendricks store thermometer readings for the previous week. 32 below. The kind of cold that existed beyond the boundary of what most people had a physical reference for. The kind of cold that killed unprepared livestock in their stalls and froze the mortar in chimneys and split the handles of metal tools left outside. In the cellar, the floor held at 59 degrees on its low cycle. She was not warm the way a woman sitting beside a roaring stove is warm. She was warm the way the earth is warm below the frost line, steadily, quietly, without drama. She slept under 2 quilts, and her feet were never cold against the stone floor, and her breath did not cloud in front of her face when she woke in the mornings, and that was enough. That was more than enough. It was, she understood, a kind of miracle that did not announce itself as miraculous because it worked by the most ordinary physics in the world, the physics of mass and patience, and the willingness to accept what the earth had already prepared. January arrived. The cold did not relent. It concentrated. The wind shifted from its usual pattern and came straight from the north, carrying air that had traveled from the Canadian plains without interruption, air that had been cold for so long it had forgotten any other temperature. The road past her property disappeared under drifts. Travel ceased. She saw no one. She heard nothing above her except the wind, which had been speaking to the barn boards for 3 weeks in a high, sustained note, like something being slowly tightened. She spoke to Roy's coat. She did not lose her hold on what was real. She was clear about that. She was a woman alone underground in January on the Dakota Plains, and she was maintaining herself through the maintenance of her routines and the maintenance of her voice, which she needed to keep working the same way she needed to keep her hands working. She said good morning to the coat. She said the temperature today and whether the light through the southern window was strong or thin. She said things she was thinking and needed to hear out loud. She said Roy's name sometimes, just the 2 syllables, the way you might say the name of a place you intend to return to. On the morning of the 12th of January, she woke to a silence that was wrong. She knew it before she was fully awake. The barn above her had been vibrating for 3 weeks with the sustained pressure of the northern wind, a low constant vibration she had stopped consciously hearing, but whose presence had become part of the texture of sleep. Now it was gone. The timbers were absolutely still. The absence of the vibration was more disturbing than the vibration itself, the way the sudden stopping of a clock in a quiet room is louder than its ticking. She climbed the stairs and pushed the slab aside. The barn was cold in a way she had not felt before. Not the ordinary deep cold of 3 weeks of winter. Something denser than that. A crystalline quality, as though the cold had refined itself down to its essential nature and was presenting that nature plainly. She walked to the barn door and looked out. The sky was wrong. It was yellow-gray. Not the white of an ordinary overcast sky. A bruised yellow-gray that sat low over the land, with a weight that was almost physical, pressing down on the flat horizon the way something large presses down on something beneath it. The line where land met sky had disappeared. The world looked sealed from above, like a lid had been fitted over it. She had never seen a sky this color. She did not need to have seen it before. Some knowledge lives in the body before the mind has named it. The body knew what this sky meant the way a body knows the smell of smoke before the eyes have found the fire. She heard hoofbeats from the east. Fast. the particular rhythm of a horse being pushed. Nathan Briggs came out of the yellow-gray distance at a hard gallop. She saw him materialize from nothing into a man on a horse moving with the urgency of someone who has calculated the remaining time and found the calculation frightening. He reached the edge of her property and pulled the horse up hard and looked at her standing in the barn doorway. They were 60 yards apart. The air between them was absolutely still. The yellow sky pressed down on both of them. He looked at her for 3 seconds. His face said everything his voice did not have time to say. Whatever is coming now. I cannot help you. Go below and stay there. He wheeled the horse and spurted east and was gone into the yellow-gray distance within moments. She went back into the barn. She moved with the efficiency of someone who has rehearsed this. She built fires in both small pots using the stockpile of dry wood she had been accumulating for this exact eventuality. Every scrap of fence rail and dry branch she had been able to collect and carry below for 2 weeks, stacked in the corner of the cellar waiting. She fired both pots simultaneously, and she crouched between them, and she fed them with the focused attention of a woman who understands that what she is doing in this hour will determine the next 3 days. She ran both fires for 2 hours. She sealed the pots. She carried the remaining emergency fuel below in 2 armloads, holding each bundle against her chest on the stairs, careful on each step. She pulled the slab closed above her and fitted it into its frame, and she sat on the bed and she waited. She heard it coming before it arrived. A sound from the north. Not wind as she had known wind. Something else. A frequency that was below wind and above it at the same time. A sound like the world being pressed between 2 surfaces at enormous pressure. And then it arrived. The barn above her went from still to violent in no interval she could measure. The timbers did not creak. They roared. The structure above her, which Roy had overbuilt, because he had always overbuilt everything he believed should last, shuddered with an impact that traveled through the earth walls of the cellar and into the stone floor and into her bones. The temperature in the cellar dropped by several degrees in the first 20 minutes. She watched the small thermometer and saw it move, the cold pressing in from above through every gap and seam in the barn floor overhead. But the stone floor held at 54 degrees. The candle flame did not move. The air in the cellar was insulated from the chaos above by 12 feet of earth and stone, and the patient physics of mass, and the candle burned straight up in perfectly still air while the world above was being unmade. The sound was the worst part, a high oscillating shriek that rose and fell with the variations in the wind's velocity produced by fine dry snow being driven horizontally at a speed that turned it into something other than weather, into a force that was reordering the landscape with no particular interest in what had been arranged there before. Nell sat on the bed with her back against the south wall and her mother's journal in her lap and her hands flat on the warm granite on either side of her. And she breathed. She breathed with the steady cadence she had developed over these weeks underground, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the breath of someone practicing the maintenance of their own calm as a deliberate act. She was afraid. She let herself be afraid. Fear requires uncertainty, and she had reduced her uncertainties to the ones she could not control, which were the integrity of the barn above, and the duration of the storm, and whether the warmth she had stored in the floor was sufficient for what was coming. Those uncertainties were real. The fear that attended them was appropriate. Everything else had been decided. The wall was mortared. The floor was laid. The system had been tested. She had done what she could do. Whatever happened next would happen without her being able to change it. She opened the journal to her mother's last entry, and she read it the way she had read it a dozen times now, finding different things in it each time, the way you find different things in a piece of land, depending on the season and the light. The men who build high walls and burn great fires are fighting the wrong battle. The cold is not a thing to defeat. It is a condition to negotiate with. The earth has already made its best offer. We only have to accept. She closed the journal. She listened to the storm, and she was warm. 7 miles east, Victor Caldwell was losing. The stove in the parlor was running at its maximum. The iron glowed. It was not enough. The heat it produced was fierce and small, a sphere of warmth with perhaps 8 feet of radius. And beyond that radius, the temperature dropped with a gradient so steep it was almost a physical wall. The parlor was bearable. The kitchen was 38 degrees. The bedrooms at the back of the house were below freezing. Harriet Caldwell had pulled the mattresses from the bedrooms on the first night. She had laid them on the parlor floor in a rough semicircle around the stove. Silas, who was 8 and had the particular bravery of a boy who does not yet understand the full range of what can happen, sat nearest the iron with a blanket over his head, like a small, determined tent. Lottie, who was 5 and had been coughing for 3 days with a wet rattle that moved lower in her chest each morning, lay in her mother's arms closest to the heat. Caldwell sat in the chair nearest the stove and he looked at the woodpile. He had 4 cords of split oak in November. He had burned through 3.5. The remaining half cord was disappearing at a rate he could no longer calculate with any comfort. The storm had been blowing for 16 hours and showed nothing that looked like stopping. He had built structures in this territory for 19 years. He had stacked wood for 19 winters, using the formula that had always been sufficient. This was not a formula winter. Harriet spoke from beside Lottie. She spoke for the first time in 2 hours. She said his name once quietly, the way a wife says a name when she wants the man she actually married, not the version he presents to the world. He looked at her over the head of their sleeping daughter. Harriet's face in the stove light was the face of a woman who has been calm for 16 hours because the children needed her to be calm and who was now assessing whether it was time to stop being calm and start being something else. "Do you think she is alive?" Harriet said. He looked at his wife. "The Marsh woman," Harriet said. "Do you think she is alive out there?" He was quiet. "You saw what she built," Harriet said. "You came home and you sat at the table and you did not tell me anything for a full hour, and then you said she had done something remarkable, and then you did not say anything else." He looked at the stove. The fire inside it was consuming wood at a rate he could now measure in hours rather than days. "I have built every house in this county," he said. "Every house in this county runs on wood. Every house in this county is losing this fight right now." Harriet said, "Except hers." He did not answer. "She built something that does not need what we have run out of," Harriet said. "That is what you would not say when you came home." He looked at Lottie, at the way his daughter's chest moved with each breath, the slight labor in it, the sound underneath the breathing that had been deepening for 3 days. He thought about the temperature of the back bedroom and what it would be by morning. He thought about what a doctor would say about a 5-year-old with a chest illness in a house that would be below freezing by morning. He stood up. Harriet looked up at him. He said, "I am going to her." She said, "You cannot survive that wind." He said, "Perhaps not." She said, "You cannot survive that." He said, "I cannot stay here. I cannot sit in this chair and watch the wood disappear, knowing there is warmth I am too proud to ask for. I cannot do that." He pulled on his heaviest coat, the fur hat down to his eyebrows, the wool scarf over the lower half of his face, his heaviest gloves. He was wrapping himself in every layer he owned, and he knew it might not be sufficient, and he was doing it anyway because the alternative was sitting in a chair watching his daughter breathe in a house that was going to be unlivable by morning. Harriet stood up, shifting Lottie carefully to keep the child asleep. She reached out and gripped his wrist with her free hand. "Come back," she said. "Yes, bring her back, if she will come." Harriet held his wrist and looked at him directly. "Be the man I know you can be, not the man you have been this year." He closed his hand over hers for 1 second. Then he turned and opened the door, and the storm came in around him like a body physical. Immediate, enormous, hitting him in the face and chest with a force that pushed him sideways into the doorframe. He stepped out into it. He pulled the door closed behind him. The world disappeared. He had lived in this territory for 23 years. He thought he understood what a Dakota winter was. He understood now that he had only ever known it from inside a building through walls and glass and the mediation of wood and iron. Out here in it, there were no walls. There was only the wind and the snow and the dark and the cold that was not a temperature, but a presence, a physical entity with mass and intention. He fell within the first 100 yards. He got up. He fell again. The snow was not a surface. It behaved like a surface, and then it did not. Hard-packed and then soft and deep, with no warning, a deception laid across the landscape. He went down on his hands and knees. The cold penetrated his gloves in the first minute. He could feel his fingers going. He got up. He oriented himself by the wind. If he kept the wind on his right cheek, he was walking west toward the Marsh property. 2 miles west in this was an ocean. He kept the wind on his right cheek, and he walked. He found the Hansen fence by feel. His hands found the wire before his eyes found it. He had built this fence in 1883 after the Hansen family had defaulted after he had acquired the property. He had built this fence with his own hands, helping the crew, and his hands remembered it now without his eyes. 19 years of touching, wire, and post and rail. A builder's hands know what the dark is holding. He followed the fence south and then west. He fell twice more. Both times he thought of Harriet's face and Lottie's breathing, and he got up. He found the corner where the Hansen fence line met the Marsh fence line. The wire changed gauge. He had noticed it once in October, riding past on business that now seemed very small. The Marsh fence had a lighter gauge, Roy Marsh's work, rather than railroad crew work. He felt the difference under his gloved fingers and turned and followed the new wire west. He fell again. He stayed down for a count of 10. He thought, I am going to die on this fence line 200 yards from her barn. He thought, no. He said it out loud inside the wool of his scarf against his own face. No. He got up. He walked. The barn materialized out of the white darkness the way things materialize in this kind of storm. Not gradually, but all at once, from nothing to there. The dark shape of the structure, appearing in the white, with a solidity that did not feel real until his hand found the wall. He felt his way to the door. His hands could not work the latch. He could not feel his fingers anymore, not individually. He put his shoulder against the door and pushed, and the door gave, and he fell through it and went down on the packed earth of the barn floor and lay there. The cold inside the barn was different from the cold outside. Still very cold, but still not moving, not hitting him. He could hear himself breathe. He could hear the storm above and outside as something separate from himself for the first time in what might have been 30 minutes or 2 hours. He turned his head against the earth floor. There was a light, faint, amber, coming from a seam in the floor perhaps 10 feet from where he lay. A glow at the edge of the stone slab. Heat. He could feel it from where he was, a warmth radiating upward from the floor at a distance, small and steady, and the most beautiful thing he had seen in his life. He crawled to it. He hit the stone slab with his fist. The sound was absorbed. He hit it again. He said hello. His voice did not sound like his voice. He said, is anyone there? Nothing. He hit the slab a third time. A scraping sound from below. The slab moved. Warm air came up in a wave, a breath of warm earth and candle smoke, and something faintly baking, the smell of a warm room that has been warm for a long time and has stored its warmth in its walls and floor. The smell of preservation. The smell of a life being maintained against all exterior argument. Her face appeared in the opening. She was holding a candle below her face, the light coming up from beneath, and she was looking at him with an expression he could not fully interpret, the look of a person who has considered a specific possibility and has now had that possibility arrive. She was wearing a cotton dress and a wool shawl. Her hair was loose on her shoulders. She had no coat because she had not needed a coat. The warmth rising from below her was the temperature of a mild autumn afternoon. Mr. Caldwell, she said. He could not form a complete sentence. His jaw was not working correctly. The cold was in him still deep in the bone, and his body was beginning to understand that it might survive and was responding to that understanding with a violence that was not entirely under his control. Come down, she said, before you freeze to death up there. Her voice was level. The levelness of it was the kindest thing he had ever heard. He half fell down the stone stairs, one hand on the cold wall, his legs doing approximately what he told them. He landed on the granite floor and stood there dripping meltwater, shaking with a violence that was both the cold leaving and something else coming in, something that had been held back for a long time and was now releasing. He looked at her. He looked at the cellar. He looked at Roy Marsh's brown wool coat hanging on the iron hook in the corner. The coat he had seen Roy wearing in his office in March on the day Roy had come to sign the extension papers. The coat Roy had worn with the careful dignity of a man who knew he was making a concession and intended to maintain his own standing while making it. The coat on the wall, Caldwell on his knees on the warm stone floor. He said, my family. She said, I know. He said, the wood is gone. The house is. She said, go. Go now and bring them here. He looked at her. She said, Mr. Caldwell, I will be here. Go now before the storm closes in again. He climbed the stairs. He stepped back into the storm. The cold took him again, but differently now entered a man moving towards something, rather than away from it, a man who knew exactly where warmth was and who had people waiting for him to return with it. He did not think about distance. He thought about Harriet. He thought about Lottie's breathing. He kept the wind on his left cheek now and moved east. He followed his own track. The track was almost gone. He found the fence. He followed the wire. He fell twice. He got up twice. He arrived at his own door. When he came through it, Harriet stood up from beside the children on the floor. He could not speak. He gestured with his arm, "West, come now." She understood without words the way people who have lived together for a long time understand each other's bodies before their voices. She stood up and began wrapping Lottie in blankets with the practiced efficiency of a woman performing an urgent task. Silas, who had been not quite asleep, sat up and looked at his father. "Are we going to Mrs. Marsh?" Silas said. Caldwell looked at his son. "Yes," he said. Silas stood up and began putting on his coat without being told. He was 8 years old and he did up the buttons himself. Caldwell tied them together with a length of rope from the hook by the door. 4 people linked at the waist a chain. He tied the knots himself, checking each one. Then he opened the door. They went into the storm. The trip back took longer than the trip out. Harriet was carrying the Lottie and could not move as fast. Silas stayed close to his mother without being told to. Caldwell kept them to the fence lines, one hand on the wire, calling back instructions through the scarf over his mouth, and they came across the frozen distance, one step at a time, until the barn wall was in front of them, and they went in through the door, and he got them down to the slab. He knocked. Nell counted 87 minutes from the moment Caldwell climbed her stairs to the moment she heard the knock on the slab. She had been pacing the floor for 50 of those minutes. She had been sitting still for the other 37, which was harder than the pacing. She had been holding 2 possibilities in her mind with equal weight, which was the most difficult kind of holding. She climbed the stairs and slid the slab. Caldwell was on his knees again. Behind him was a woman holding a small child wrapped in so many blankets the child was mostly invisible inside them. Behind the woman was a boy, perhaps 8, with wide eyes that were taking in everything and saying nothing. All of them white with snow, all of them shaking, all of them alive. Nell did not speak. She reached up and she took the child first. Lottie was cold in a way that went beyond the cold of skin and surface. The cold was in her weight and the quality of the air around her, a cold that had been accumulating over 16 hours in a house that had run out of the means to fight it. Nell carried her down the stairs and laid her on the bed and unwrapped the outer blanket and looked at the small face. She was breathing. Her color was poor, and her breathing had the wet labor in it that spoke of small lungs working too hard in the cold. But she was breathing. That was the thing that mattered. That was the only thing. Harriet came down next, then Silas, then Caldwell, who pulled the slab closed above him. With the last organized movement his arms would perform before his legs gave out, and he sat down on the cellar floor and put his back against the stone wall and his face in his hands. The 5 of them were in the cellar. The candle burned straight up. The granite floor radiated its patient warmth into the still air. Harriet Caldwell was looking at Nell across the small underground room with the look of a woman who has arrived somewhere she did not expect and who understands completely what has been done for her and for her children. She did not say thank you. Thank you was a word shaped for smaller debts. She held Nell's eyes and Nell held hers, and then Nell nodded once the way Agnes had nodded to her in the cellar 3 weeks ago and turned back to Lottie. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palm against the child's cheek. She felt the cold in it. She felt it beginning very slowly with the patience the warm stone floor had taught her about patience to leave. She tucked the smaller quilt around the small body corners and edges, the way her mother had tucked her in when she was a child in Minnesota in a house that smelled like cedar and dried lavender. She pressed her hand against the child's cheek again and held it there. Silas had fallen asleep against his mother on the folded coat Harriet had spread on the floor. Harriet sat with her back against the wall and the boy against her side, and Lottie asleep on the bed, and she looked at nothing in particular with the expression of a woman who has crossed something and is only now understanding what she crossed. Caldwell sat in the corner. He sat for a long time without speaking. The storm above them continued. The earth around them continued at its own temperature, at its own pace, unhurried by what was happening on its surface. After a long time, he looked across the candlelight at Nell. He said 14 families. She waited. He said, I told myself each one was a clean resolution. The railroad held the notes. The settlers could not pay. I facilitated the transfer of titles. Each one a clean line in a ledger. He stopped. He looked at his hands. Each one, he said, ended up where I put them, not where they belonged. Nell looked at him in the candlelight. She looked at the man who had come to her fence line in October on a rehearsed horse with a rehearsed speech in a satchel full of manufactured numbers. She looked at the man who had walked 2 miles through a blizzard on his knees and gotten up. She said, I am not going to tell you that I forgive you, Mr. Caldwell. Forgiveness is not mine to dispense on behalf of 14 families and one man named Ezra Whitmore, who built this cellar and was pushed off this land before me. What I am going to tell you is this. My work tonight was to not let your daughter die in a house that ran out of wood. That is the work I chose when I opened that slab. It is a separate thing from forgiveness. I know the difference between the two. He nodded, a slow nod, the nod of a man absorbing something. He said, when this is over, when the storm is done and we are alive and the ground thaws, I will go to the railroad office in Bismarck and I will restructure your note. I will repay Agnes Polk for the 40 acres my father took from her husband in '78. I will go to every family I displaced. I will not pretend that is enough. She said it is not enough. He said, I know. She said it is a beginning. He nodded again. The candle guttered. She did not light another. The dark filled the corners of the cellar gently, the way dark fills any space that is warm enough and quiet enough, leaving the center lit by the last orange glow of the damped pots and the faint pale light from the southern window. That was nothing but storm. Now storm, pressing against the glass from outside while the inside held its warmth. She lay down on the far side of the bed beside Lottie, who was breathing easier now, the wet labor in her chest diminishing as the warmth worked its way through her. Nell lay on her back and looked at the brick arch above her and listened to the breathing of 3 sleeping people and the distant roar of the storm that could not reach them. She thought about her mother. She thought about the blue cups on the shelf in the Minnesota kitchen and the window above the sink and the way Mabel Fontaine had drawn those cross-sections in her careful slanted hand and put them in a journal and folded the journal into a trunk, and the trunk had made 3 moves and ended up at the foot of a bed in Dakota waiting. She thought you knew someone would need this. She thought I was the one who needed it. She slept. The storm lasted 3 days. On the 4th morning, the wind stopped with the abruptness of a machine being switched off. A silence descended on the territory that had physical properties, a silence with weight and depth, and a quality of aftermath that made everything visible in it seem newly particular. The sky cleared to a blue so deep it did not look like sky. It looked like something permanent. Nell pushed the slab open and climbed into the barn. The cold inside was sharp and honest, and nothing like the lethal cold of the storm. The light coming through the west in the barn boards was brilliant winter sun on new snow, and it lay across the barn floor in bright slanted bars. Silas came up first. He stood in the barn and looked at the light with the expression of a boy who has been underground for 3 days and is making a private accounting of the world above. Then he walked to the barn door and pushed it open and stood in the opening and breathed. Harriet came up with Lottie, who was awake and whose color had come back overnight, the pink of life returning to the pale. She breathed. She breathed clearly. The wet rattle was gone from her chest. Harriet held her and stood in the barn with her eyes closed. Caldwell came up last. He stood in the barn door and looked east. His house was visible from here, just visible above a long white slope of drifted snow, the roofline dark against the blue sky. He looked at the chimney. The chimney was not smoking. The wood had run out. The fire was long cold. The house beyond the drifts was somewhere below, freezing and had been for hours, if they had stayed. He turned from the doorway and looked at Nell. She was standing behind him watching. He looked at her the way a person looks at something that has become true in a way that cannot be walked back. He opened his mouth and nothing came. There was nothing adequate. She looked back at him. She nodded once. He turned to his family. He put his arm around Harriet's shoulders and held her and Lottie both for a moment, and Silas, who was 8 and had never needed anyone to tell him when something important was happening, put his hand into his father's coat pocket and held on. Nell walked past them through the barn door out into the white silence of the world after the storm. She walked north. The drifts reached her knees in places and her waist in others, and she picked her way through them with the patient attention of a woman who has learned to work with what the land gives her rather than against it. The air was cold but still. The sun was on her face. The light off the snow was extraordinary. Everything made equal and brilliant and new by the covering, the way fresh snow remakes a landscape into something that has no history. Only now she walked north toward the creek. She was halfway there when she saw a figure coming south. They saw each other across 200 yards of white field, two women, 164 and 172, coming toward each other across a landscape that had tried its best to prevent this meeting and had not succeeded. Agnes Polk walked with her left arm swinging and her right arm held against her coat in its splint, and her face turned into the winter sun with the expression of a woman who has survived something considerable and is taking a moment to acknowledge that fact. They could not run. The drifts did not permit running. They walked toward each other, and the distance between them closed in the patient way. Distances close when you keep putting one foot in front of the other and do not stop. They met. Agnes opened her good arm. Nell stepped into it. The two women stood in the snow field in the winter sunlight and held each other and did not say anything. There was nothing that needed to be said. They had both been underground, and they had both survived, and they were both standing in the cold, bright air of after, and the standing was enough. The being alive and upright on the land they had earned was enough. Above them, from somewhere in the bare cottonwoods along the creek bank, a small brown sparrow launched itself into the cold air. It circled once low and purposeful, and then it flew south into the light. The spring that year came in layers, the way spring always comes to the northern plains, not all at once, but in degrees the way the cold had come, in degrees in the other direction each day, giving back a little of what winter had taken. The creek ran first at the center and then at the edges. The ground thawed from the surface down in reverse of how it had frozen. The cottonwoods put out their first tentative leaves, thin and pale, testing the air before committing. Caldwell kept his word. He went to the railroad office in Bismarck in February while the snow was still on the ground, and he restructured Nell's note. 3 years reduced interest terms that Roy had originally been promised before the numbers had been altered. He paid Agnes Polk in cash for the 40 acres of Thomas's bottomland that his father had taken in 1878. Agnes took the money without comment. She put it in a tin in her kitchen. She used it that summer to replace the roof on her barn, which had needed replacing since 1881, and which she had been putting off because the money had not been there. Caldwell went to the other families. Not all of them could be reached. Not all of them would speak to him. Some of the land could not be returned because it had already passed through additional transactions, and the chain of ownership had grown too long to untangle. He went anyway. He sat at the kitchen tables of the families he had displaced, and he said what he had come to say, and he made the restitution that was possible, and acknowledged the restitution that was not. He did not ask to be forgiven. He did not announce what he was doing. He simply went and did it and came home and sat at his own kitchen table and looked at the work that remained. Nathan Briggs came to Nell's gate on a morning in late March when the mud was beginning and the light was lasting longer each day. He did not come on behalf of Caldwell. He came on his own on a horse he had purchased himself, and he stood at the gate with his hat in his hands and said he understood if she wanted no connection to anything that had been part of what had happened to her. But if she needed any help with the property, with fencing or building or the work of spring, he would like to do useful work for someone who deserved to have useful work done for them. Nell looked at him for a long moment. She said the west fence needs relaying from the northwest corner to the creek. Roy never got to it. Nathan said he could do that. She said, I will pay you what I can, which is not much this first year. He said that was fine. He went to work on the fence that afternoon, and he was still going when Agnes arrived the following morning with her blue enamel coffee pot and her good wrist, and her healing wrist, and the particular efficiency of a woman who sees what needs to be done and begins without being asked. They sat on the porch steps in the April sunlight, Nell and Agnes with their cups in their hands and the cottonwoods deciding on their leaves above them, and the creek audible from here, running strong with the snow melt. The light was warm in the direct way. Spring light in the Northern Territories is warm, not gentle, but generous, like something returned after a long withholding. Agnes poured from the blue pot. She said, I have lived a long time, Nell Marsh. I have not seen many things like what you did this winter. Nell turned the cup in her hands. She thought about what to say and then said what was true. I did what my mother wrote down, she said. I only followed the instructions she left. Agnes shook her head. That is not what you did, she said. What your mother wrote down was a set of drawings. What you did was get up off the floor and follow them alone in November in Dakota with 34 days and two bad hands and a man waiting for you to give up. That is not following instructions. That is something else entirely. Nell did not answer. She was looking at the yard at the barn, at the line of the west fence where Nathan was already working the sound of the post maul, carrying across the cold, clear morning at regular intervals. She thought about Ezra Whitmore's notebook on the shelf beside her mother's journal. She thought about the seeds. She set down her cup. She went inside and came back out with the small cloth bag from the hidden chamber, the bag sealed with wax that she had opened in the cellar in November when she was sitting on the warm stone floor crying. She had kept the seeds in the cabin through the winter on the shelf above the stove where it was driest. She walked to the edge of the yard where the kitchen garden had been, where the soil was already beginning to soften in the sun. She crouched down. Her knees said what they always said. She pressed her palm flat against the earth the way she had pressed it against the cellar floor on the first morning she found the door. The ground was cold at the surface. Below, she knew it was warmer. Below the frost line, it had been warm all winter. It had held the warmth of the previous summer all the way through and was giving it back now to the surface where things could grow. She opened the bag. She pressed the first seed into the earth with her thumb. She thought about Ezra Whitmore, who had saved these seeds and sealed them in wax and left them in the dark for whoever came next. She thought about what it meant to plant a seed that someone else had saved across 10 winters, and 2 families of thieves and 1 woman who had known what to do with what she found. She thought about all the things that had been preserved and passed forward in the dark. Her mother's drawings, Whitmore's instructions, the warmth in the stone floor, that was the warmth of last summer held underground through everything winter had tried to do. She planted the seeds in a row, pressing each one in with her thumb, her knees on the cold ground, the sun on her shoulders. Agnes sitting on the porch steps behind her with her coffee and her silence, which was the most companionable silence Nell had ever sat inside. When the row was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at the turned earth. She was 64 years old. She was a widow. She was a woman with her name on a deed and a cellar under her barn, in a kitchen garden that was going to come up this summer from seeds that had waited since 1879 for someone to plant them. She was a woman who had read her mother's handwriting in the cold lamplight of a night when she had needed it most, and had followed those words down into the earth and come back up alive. She thought of Roy. She thought of him in the specific way she had learned to think of him now, which was not with the sharp edge of new grief, but with the settled knowledge of someone learning to carry a precious thing rather than mourn its absence. She thought of him looking at his hands while he said the things that mattered so the words would not scatter. He had been right. She was stronger than she knew. She understood that now in her hands and her back and her 64-year-old knees and the calluses that had formed at the base of every finger over 34 days of work, she had not known she could do. She understood it the way Agnes had said knowledge comes through the body first and then the mind, and then it stays. She was not afraid of the next winter. She knew where the warmth was. She had built it. She had dug down through everything that said stop, through grief and cold and manufactured debt and the long patient pressure of men who expected the script to play out as written, and she had found what the earth had been keeping all along. And it was hers. All of it. The deed and the cellar and the warm stone floor and the seeds going into the ground and the spring light on her shoulders and the blue cups on the shelf inside and the 2 journals on the shelf underground and the 87 minutes she had spent pacing and the 43 steps she had counted behind a pine box in October and the 38 years in the warmth of a man who had always run slightly hotter than the air around him. She pressed one more seed into the earth. The cottonwoods moved above her in the light spring wind, their new leaves turning and catching the sun in the particular way they had, silver and green, and the sound they made was the sound of a living thing that had endured the winter and was now simply without ceremony being itself again.